Before the Pharaohs. Long before Egypt had pyramids, royal tombs, or monumental temples, the Nile already shaped the rhythm of life. The river crossed a vast dry landscape and created a narrow corridor where water, plants, animals, and people could survive. Communities gathered along its banks because the surrounding desert made dependable water unusually precious. Seasonal floods renewed fields with fertile silt and helped create conditions for agriculture. Over many generations, villages grew larger and more connected. People exchanged stone, pottery, grain, livestock, and ideas. They learned the moods of the river and the limits of the desert. Ancient Egypt did not suddenly appear when the first king placed a crown on his head. Its foundations were built slowly by families who learned how to live beside one of the world's great rivers. A green ribbon through the desert. From above, the contrast is still striking. The Nile appears as a green ribbon bordered by pale desert. In antiquity, that contrast shaped Egyptian ideas about order and danger. The cultivated valley offered food, water, villages, and familiar roads. Beyond it stretched dry lands where travel became more difficult. The Egyptians later called the fertile black soil of the valley the Black Land, while the desert was the Red Land. Both mattered. The fields fed the population, but the desert supplied stone, minerals, trade routes, and natural protection. The river was also a highway. Boats moved people and cargo more easily than long journeys across land. A civilization that stretched hundreds of kilometers could remain connected because the Nile carried grain, officials, soldiers, craftsmen, letters, and news between distant communities. The flood. For much of Egyptian history, the annual Nile flood was one of the most important events of the year. Water rose during the summer and spread across low-lying fields. When it withdrew, it left moist soil ready for planting. The flood was never perfectly predictable. A weak flood could bring hunger. An unusually high one could damage homes and fields. Communities therefore watched the river carefully and developed ways to manage water through basins, channels, and local cooperation. The agricultural calendar followed the cycle of inundation, planting, and harvest. This did not mean life was easy. Farming demanded constant labor, and the state could collect part of the harvest as tax. Yet the Nile made large and dependable food surpluses possible, and those surpluses supported towns, temples, administrators, craftsmen, and eventually the immense building projects for which Egypt became famous. Two lands. Ancient Egyptians often described their kingdom as the two lands. Upper Egypt lay to the south, where the Nile flowed through a relatively narrow valley. Lower Egypt lay to the north, where the river divided into branches across the broad delta before reaching the Mediterranean. The names can feel reversed to a modern map reader, but they follow the river's elevation. Upper Egypt is upstream. Lower Egypt is downstream. The distinction remained important for thousands of years. Kings wore symbols representing both regions, and royal titles emphasized their authority over the united country. Yet unity did not erase local identity. Towns had their own gods, traditions, economic roles, and powerful families. Egyptian history repeatedly balanced a strong idea of a single kingdom with the reality of many communities spread along a very long river. South to north. The direction of the Nile can be confusing because the river flows from south to north. Traveling downstream carries a boat toward the delta and the Mediterranean. Traveling upstream leads toward Upper Egypt, Aswan, and Nubia. Ancient sails and currents made both directions practical under the right conditions. This simple geography helped create a long kingdom that could still function as a connected corridor. The first farmers and craftspeople. By the 4th millennium before the Common Era, communities in the Nile Valley were developing increasingly complex forms of farming, craft, and exchange. Pottery styles changed. Skilled workers shaped stone vessels and tools. Long-distance trade brought materials not available locally. Graves sometimes contained objects that suggest growing differences in wealth and status. Archaeologists use these traces to understand a period that left no continuous written history. The people themselves could not know that later generations would call their world pre-dynastic Egypt. They were simply living through gradual change. Larger settlements formed. Leaders gained influence. Competition connected local politics with control of land, labor, trade, and ritual. The same river that tied communities together could also make it possible for ambitious rulers to extend influence from one settlement to the next. Towards unification. By around 3100 BC, political power had become concentrated enough for rulers to claim authority over both Upper and Lower Egypt. Later tradition remembered a king called Menes as the founder of the unified kingdom, while archaeology often focuses on rulers such as Narmer. The famous Narmer palette shows a king wearing different royal crowns and defeating enemies, but it is not a simple photograph of one historical battle. It is a carefully designed statement about royal power. Unification was probably a process rather than a single morning when two countries suddenly became one. However it happened, the result was important. Egypt now possessed a kingship capable of organizing resources over a long distance. Royal administration, writing, taxation, and ceremonial traditions grew together, forming patterns that later dynasties would inherit. Writing and administration. Early Egyptian writing developed alongside administration. Hieroglyphs could record names, titles, offerings, sacred phrases, and royal achievements. Scribes also used faster forms of writing on materials, such as papyrus and pottery. Literacy was limited, and most people never became professional readers or writers. That made scribes valuable. A government ruling a long river valley needed records of fields, taxes, workers, supplies, temple estates, and royal property. Writing helped turn spoken commands into durable administration. It also gave the state a way to preserve memory. Names could be carved on stone. Kings could present their reigns as part of a sacred order. Centuries later, those inscriptions became some of the most important evidence available to historians, though they must be read carefully because royal texts often describe how rulers wanted events to be remembered. The Pharaoh. Modern speakers usually use the word pharaoh for any ancient Egyptian king, although the term itself became a royal title only later in Egyptian history. The king stood at the center of the political and religious system. He was expected to protect the country, honor the gods, defend borders, maintain temples, and preserve Maat, the ideal of order, balance, truth, and proper relationship. This did not mean every ruler personally controlled every detail of government. Egypt depended on officials, governors, scribes, priests, soldiers, and local elites. Royal authority was strongest when these groups cooperated. When central power weakened, regional leaders could become more independent. Egyptian kingship was therefore both an idea and an institution. The idea could remain impressive even during periods when the real power of a particular king was limited. Memphis and the early state. The area around Memphis became an important political center near the point where the Nile Valley opens toward the delta. Its position helped rulers connect Upper and Lower Egypt. From here, officials could oversee fertile land, river transport, workshops, and royal estates. The early Egyptian state did not operate like a modern government with ministries and concrete buildings. Authority rested on households, estates, temples, personal loyalty, record-keeping, and access to agricultural surplus. Grain was especially important because it could be stored and redistributed. Workers could receive rations in food and other goods. The state's ability to collect and organize resources made large construction possible. Before the Great Pyramids appeared at Giza, kings and officials were already experimenting with monumental tombs, stone architecture, and increasingly complex ways of displaying royal power. Saqqara and the Step Pyramid. At Saqqara, the tomb complex of King Djoser marked a major moment in Egyptian architecture. Built during the Third Dynasty, the Step Pyramid rose through a series of stacked levels and transformed earlier tomb traditions into something new. The architect Imhotep later became famous in Egyptian memory and was eventually honored as a figure of wisdom and healing. The complex used enormous amounts of stone and required planning, quarrying, transport, skilled masonry, food supply, and administration. It was more than a tomb. Courtyards, ceremonial buildings, walls, and symbolic spaces created a landscape for royal eternity. The Step Pyramid also showed what the Egyptian state could now attempt. Stone architecture could imitate forms once built in perishable materials and preserve them for generations. The age of the giant pyramid was approaching. Why build pyramids? The pyramids grew from Egyptian beliefs about kingship, death, and the afterlife. A royal tomb protected the body and burial goods, but it also formed part of a wider ritual system. The dead king was expected to continue in a transformed existence and to remain connected with divine order. Pyramid complexes included temples, causeways, offering places, and subsidiary structures. Priests and estates could maintain the king's cult long after his death. The pyramid itself became a monumental statement visible across the landscape. It joined royal power with the horizon, the sun, and ideas of rebirth. Historians still debate the precise meaning of every architectural choice because Egyptian religious ideas changed over time. What is clear is that the pyramids were not isolated piles of stone. They were parts of carefully organized sacred and economic complexes. Sneferu and experiment. Before the Great Pyramid of Giza, Egyptian builders spent decades learning how to create true pyramids. King Sneferu of the 4th dynasty is associated with several enormous monuments. The pyramid at Midim may have undergone major changes. At Dahshur, the bent pyramid famously changes angle partway up, perhaps because builders adjusted the design while construction was underway. Nearby, the Red Pyramid achieved a more consistent shape and is often described as the first successful large true pyramid. These monuments reveal experimentation rather than instant perfection. Surveyors, quarry workers, engineers, masons, transport crews, and administrators learned from earlier projects. The process matters because it removes some of the mystery surrounding Giza. The Great Pyramid did not appear from nowhere. It grew out of generations of increasingly ambitious construction and accumulated practical knowledge. Khufu and the Great Pyramid. Around the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, King Khufu ordered the monument that became the largest pyramid at Giza. The Great Pyramid originally stood about 146 meters high. Its core contains millions of stone blocks, while finer limestone once covered much of the exterior. Inside, passages and chambers reveal a complicated design that changed during construction or was planned in stages that scholars continue to study. The achievement was extraordinary, but it did not require lost technology. Egyptians had stone tools, copper tools, wooden equipment, ropes, sledges, boats, organized labor, and generations of building experience. The hardest problem was not one magical lifting technique. It was coordination. Quarrying, transporting, feeding, housing, scheduling, measuring, and supervising thousands of people demanded an administration capable of maintaining a project over many years. The workers of Giza. Older popular stories often imagine the pyramids as the work of vast armies of enslaved people. Archaeology gives a more complex picture. Settlements near Giza contained bakeries, food remains, workshops, storage areas, and burials connected with the workforce. Many laborers may have been seasonal workers who served during periods when agricultural work slowed, alongside permanent skilled crews. This was still demanding state labor, and ancient society was highly unequal, but the evidence does not support the familiar image of countless chained slaves building the Great Pyramid. Workers needed enormous quantities of bread, beer, meat, fish, vegetables, tools, clothing, and shelter. Their settlement reminds us that a monument is also a story of logistics. Every block depended on people whose names are mostly forgotten, but whose organized effort changed the Egyptian landscape forever. Boats and stone. The Nile made pyramid building possible in ways that are easy to overlook from photographs of the desert plateau. Stone could be moved by boat from quarries along the river. During seasons of higher water, canals and basins brought transport closer to construction zones. Ancient images from later periods show heavy objects being dragged on sledges while liquid is poured in front, a technique that can reduce friction on sand. Workers used ramps in some form, though scholars continue to debate exactly how different ramps were arranged at different stages. The important point is that Egyptian engineering was practical and adaptable. Boats, ropes, wooden sledges, levers, prepared roads, and large coordinated teams could accomplish remarkable work. The river was not merely scenery beside the pyramids. It was part of the transport system that helped create them. Khafre, Menkaure, and the Sphinx. Khufu's successors continued to build at Giza. Khafre's pyramid appears especially tall because it stands on slightly higher ground and some casing stones remain near its summit. Menkaure's pyramid is smaller, but its complex still required major resources. Near Khafre's monuments stands the Great Sphinx, carved from the local limestone bedrock. Its human head and lion's body created one of the most recognizable images of ancient Egypt. The exact history and symbolism of the Sphinx have inspired many debates, but mainstream archaeology places it firmly within the Old Kingdom landscape at Giza. Together, the pyramids, temples, causeways, cemeteries, and Sphinx formed a dense ceremonial zone. Giza was not simply three isolated pyramids. It was a planned landscape of royal memory, ritual activity, elite burials, workers, priests, and visitors. An Old Kingdom at work. The Old Kingdom is often remembered as the Age of Pyramids, but most Egyptians did not spend their days beside royal monuments. They farmed, herded animals, fished, baked bread, brewed beer, raised children, repaired houses, and participated in local religious life. Officials supervised fields and collected revenue. Craftspeople produced pottery, furniture, tools, jewelry, stone vessels, and textiles. Elite tomb scenes show idealized images of agriculture and workshops, giving historians valuable details while also reflecting how wealthy patrons wished to present an ordered world. Egypt's economy was based largely on agricultural production rather than coinage. Goods and labor could be collected, stored, and redistributed through royal, temple, and household institutions. Monumental architecture rested on this much broader foundation of ordinary work. When central power weakened. After centuries of strong Old Kingdom kingship, the central state gradually weakened. The exact causes remain debated. Long reigns, changing patterns of royal resources, stronger provincial elites, environmental stress, and political competition may all have contributed. By the period historians call the First Intermediate Period, regional rulers held greater independence and competing centers claimed authority. This era was once described simply as collapse, but archaeology shows that life continued and some regions even prospered. Local elites built tombs, commissioned art, and managed resources. The important change was political fragmentation. Egypt's ideal of unity survived, yet the kingdom was divided. Eventually, rulers based at Thebes in Upper Egypt gained enough strength to reunify the country, beginning a new phase that historians call the Middle Kingdom. The desert edge. Again and again, Egyptian settlements occupied the meeting point between fertile ground and desert. That boundary was practical and symbolic. Fields needed every strip of good soil, while cemeteries and some monuments could occupy the dry margins. From the air, the border appears almost drawn with a ruler. In reality, canals, dunes, villages, and shifting river channels made it more complicated. The Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom, beginning around 2055 BCE, is sometimes less famous than the Pyramid Age or the New Kingdom, but it was one of Egypt's major periods of political and cultural development. Kings strengthened central administration and expanded influence southward into Nubia. Literature flourished in forms that later Egyptians considered classics. Royal building continued, though pyramids of this period often used different construction methods and have survived less dramatically than the stone giants of Giza. Officials left autobiographical inscriptions describing careers, loyalty, travel, and local responsibility. The state invested in irrigation and agricultural regions, such as the Fayum. Middle Kingdom Egypt looked back to older traditions while creating new ones. It demonstrates a repeated pattern in Egyptian history. Political fragmentation could be followed by reunification, renewal, and a fresh interpretation of royal authority. The Nile in everyday life. For an ordinary family, the river remained more immediate than distant royal politics. Water had to be carried. Fields had to be prepared. Animals needed care. Boats crossed between communities and carried goods to market. Mud from the river helped make bricks for houses, while reeds supplied useful materials for baskets, mats, boats, and writing surfaces. Fish and waterfowl added to the diet. The river could also be dangerous, with currents, crocodiles in some periods and regions, and the constant risk of accidents. Egyptian art often presents an ideal abundance of marshes, birds, fish, and cultivated fields. Those scenes remind us that the Nile was not merely an economic resource. It was part of memory, religion, leisure, work, and identity. Life in Egypt was life arranged around water. Homes and villages. Most ancient Egyptian houses were built from mud brick rather than monumental stone. That is one reason temples and tombs survive more visibly than ordinary neighborhoods. A typical home varied according to wealth and period, but rooms might surround areas for cooking, storage, sleeping, and household work. Roofs could provide additional living space in dry weather. Furniture was limited by modern standards, but could include stools, beds, chests, mats, and baskets. Food storage mattered because grain, oil, beer, onions, dates, and other staples had to last between harvests. In dense settlements, people lived close to neighbors, animals, workshops, smoke, dust, insects, and noise. Ancient Egypt can look silent when seen through ruined monuments, but its towns and villages would have been filled with ordinary conversation and constant practical activity. Bread and beer. Bread and beer were central foods for much of the population. Grain, especially emmer wheat and barley, passed through many stages of processing before it reached the table. Grinding grain was hard daily work, often done with stone tools. Bread came in many shapes and recipes. Egyptian beer was different from many modern beers and formed part of regular nutrition, as well as ritual and celebration. Wealthier households could enjoy a wider variety of meat, fruit, wine, and imported foods, while ordinary diets depended heavily on grain, vegetables, onions, legumes, fish, and seasonal produce. Tomb offerings display ideal meals because food was expected to matter after death as well as during life. The enormous state itself also depended on food. Rations helped support workers, soldiers, craftsmen, and crews engaged in royal projects. Family and childhood. Family relationships were central to Egyptian social life. Marriage was usually a household arrangement rather than a religious ceremony documented by the state in the way many modern societies expect. Women could own property, inherit, make contracts, and bring legal cases, though daily opportunities still depended heavily on wealth and status. Children were valued, and large families provided both emotional bonds and practical support. Childhood could also be fragile because disease and injury were common. Toys, small figurines, drawings, and informal writings give glimpses of a world beyond royal monuments. Egyptian art sometimes shows parents and children in affectionate poses. Those images cannot tell us everything about private emotion, but they remind us that this civilization was built from households as much as palaces. Behind every dynasty were millions of personal lives. Craft and skill. Egyptian craftsmen transformed local and imported materials into objects of remarkable precision. Stoneworkers carved hard stones that required patience and abrasive techniques. Carpenters valued timber because large quality wood was relatively scarce in Egypt, encouraging trade with regions such as Lebanon. Metalworkers used copper and later bronze, while gold from Egypt and Nubia became especially important for royal and temple wealth. Glassmaking developed to produce brightly colored vessels and inlays. Textile workers spun and wove linen from flax. Many skilled workers remained anonymous, but some communities are unusually well documented. At Deir el-Medina, near the Valley of the Kings, the people who decorated royal tombs left letters, legal records, sketches, jokes, complaints, and work notes. Their documents make ancient labor feel unexpectedly close. Religion everywhere. Religion in ancient Egypt was woven into daily life, rather than separated into 1 hour of the week. People honored major gods, local gods, household deities, protective spirits, and deceased relatives. Temples served as homes for divine images and as large economic institutions owning land, workshops, animals, and storage facilities. Most people did not enter the most sacred inner rooms. Priests performed rituals on behalf of the king and community. At home, families might use small images, amulets, prayers, and offerings for protection. Egyptian religion changed over 3,000 years, and no single list of beliefs can describe every period. Yet one theme remains strong: the world depended on maintaining order through correct relationships between humans, gods, nature, kingship, and the dead. Osiris and the hope of renewal. Among the most enduring religious stories was the cycle of Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Seth. The details varied across texts and centuries, but Osiris became closely connected with death, regeneration, and rightful kingship. According to later forms of the story, Osiris was killed by Seth and restored through the actions of Isis, while their son Horus became his father's heir. The myth linked family, royal succession, the fertile land, and hopes for life after death. Over time, ordinary people increasingly identified with Osiris in funerary belief. The dead hoped for renewal, provided that proper rituals were performed and moral expectations were met. The river's seasonal cycles and the agricultural world offered familiar images of disappearance and return. Egyptian religion repeatedly turned natural rhythms into ways of thinking about eternity. Death was a journey. Egyptian burial practices rested on the belief that a human being continued in several forms after death. The body mattered, but so did the name, memory, spirit, social identity, and ritual relationship with the living. Mummification developed over centuries as embalmers learned ways to preserve the body by drying and treating it. Wealthy burials could include coffins, amulets, food, furniture, clothing, texts, and small figures intended to serve the deceased. Poor Egyptians had fewer resources, yet they also participated in funerary traditions in simpler ways. Tombs were places of memory and ritual exchange between the living and the dead. Modern fascination with mummies can sometimes make Egyptian burial seem mysterious or macabre. For Egyptians themselves, these practices were largely about continuity, protection, and the hope that life could continue in another form. The Second Intermediate Period. The Middle Kingdom eventually gave way to another period of political division. In the north, rulers known as the Hyksos controlled important parts of the Delta. They were connected with populations of Near Eastern origin who had entered Egypt through migration and settlement over time. Older accounts sometimes imagined a sudden foreign invasion, but the process was more complex. The Hyksos adopted many Egyptian customs while also bringing or popularizing technologies and military practices associated with Western Asia, including new forms of weaponry and the horse-drawn chariot. In the south, Theban rulers built their own power. Conflict eventually led to the expulsion of the Hyksos from their northern strongholds. The victorious Theban dynasty then founded the New Kingdom, an era when Egypt became more deeply involved in the politics of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The New Kingdom begins. Around 1550 BCE, rulers from Thebes reunified Egypt and began the New Kingdom. The experience of foreign rule in the Delta may have encouraged later kings to think more aggressively about security beyond Egypt's traditional borders. Egyptian armies campaigned into Nubia and the Levant. Tribute, trade, and conquest brought new wealth into royal and temple institutions. Thebes became a major religious center associated especially with the god Ammonius. Monumental building expanded at Karnak, Luxor, and other sites. New Kingdom rulers presented themselves as victorious warriors, but their success still depended on administrators, diplomats, local allies, craftsmen, farmers, and soldiers. Egypt was now one of several great powers competing and negotiating across the Eastern Mediterranean world. War mattered, but so did marriage alliances, gifts, letters, and trade. A slow civilization. The pace of change in Egyptian history was often slower than the pace of modern political life. A temple could remain active for centuries. A text could be copied long after its language became old-fashioned. A royal symbol could survive many dynasties. That long memory gave Egyptian culture unusual depth, even when wars or foreign rulers interrupted political continuity. Hatshepsut. One of the most remarkable New Kingdom rulers was Hatshepsut. She first acted as regent for the young Thutmose III and later assumed full royal titles. Egyptian kingship was traditionally expressed through male imagery, so Hatshepsut's monuments present her in different ways, sometimes as a woman and sometimes with conventional masculine royal forms. Her reign emphasized building, religious legitimacy, and trade. The reliefs at her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari famously depict an expedition to the land of Punt, showing exotic plants, goods, and people. After her death, some of her images and names were erased, probably for political reasons connected with royal succession. Yet enough survived to reconstruct a reign that lasted around 2 decades. Her monuments still rise against the cliffs west of the Nile. Thutmose III and Empire. Thutmose III became one of Egypt's most successful military kings. His campaigns in the Levant extended Egyptian influence over a network of cities and local rulers. The Battle of Megiddo became famous because Egyptian inscriptions preserve a detailed royal account. Like all victory texts, it celebrates the king and should not be read as neutral reporting. Still, it provides unusual information about strategy, movement, siege, and the collection of tribute. Egyptian rule outside the Nile Valley did not mean direct administration everywhere. Local leaders often remained in place while recognizing Egyptian supremacy, sending payments, and providing hostages or heirs for education at the Egyptian court. The empire connected Egypt more closely to horses, chariots, luxury goods, diplomatic marriages, and the politics of Syria and Palestine. Karnak. At Karnak, generations of kings added pylons, courts, halls, obelisks, shrines, statues, and inscriptions to an enormous temple complex dedicated primarily to Ammonius-Ra. The site is difficult to understand as one building because it grew over more than 1,000 years. Each ruler could attach new construction to older sacred space, using architecture to demonstrate piety and political legitimacy. The Great Hypostyle Hall, with its forest of massive columns, belongs mainly to the Ramesside period. In antiquity, the temple would have been bright with paint, flags, precious metal, ritual equipment, priests, workers, and visitors moving through different zones. The surviving stone can feel monochrome today, but ancient Karnak was a living institution. It owned land, employed people, stored wealth, and participated directly in the economic and political life of Egypt. Luxor and the festival. South of Karnak, the temple now called Luxor Temple was closely linked to royal renewal and the worship of Ammonius. During the Opet festival, sacred images traveled in procession between Karnak and Luxor, sometimes by river and sometimes along the ceremonial route later lined with sphinxes. Festivals temporarily transformed the relationship between temples and the wider population. Even when ordinary people could not enter the deepest sacred rooms, processions brought divine images into more public spaces. Music, food, crowds, boats, ritual, and celebration filled the city. The surviving temples are quiet archaeological monuments today, but they were once surrounded by houses, workshops, docks, streets, gardens, and the constant movement of people. Thebes was both sacred landscape and busy urban community. Across the river to the west, the western bank of the Nile at Thebes became a vast landscape of temples, tombs, villages, paths, and desert cliffs. Because the sun set in the west, the direction gained strong associations with death and the afterlife, though the symbolism was more complex than one simple rule. New Kingdom kings abandoned the giant pyramids of earlier dynasties and placed their tombs in hidden desert valleys. Their mortuary temples remained closer to cultivated land. This separation created a broad sacred geography. Processions connected temples, river crossings, and burial places. Workers traveled from Deir el-Medina toward royal tomb construction sites. Priests maintained cults for dead kings. From the air, the contrast between green fields and barren mountains makes the relationship between life, death, river, and desert especially clear. The Valley of the Kings. The Valley of the Kings contains dozens of royal and elite tombs cut deep into limestone hills. The location offered a degree of concealment, but tomb robbery remained a serious problem. Passages and chambers were decorated with religious texts and images designed to guide the king through the dangerous hours of night toward rebirth. Different tombs used different plans because beliefs and architectural choices changed over time. Teams of specialist workers carved and painted the walls under the supervision of officials. Royal burials included coffins, shrines, jewelry, furniture, food, ritual objects, and other goods. Most tombs were robbed in antiquity, sometimes after the state itself had weakened. The survival of Tutankhamun's burial with much of its equipment was therefore highly unusual and later transformed public understanding of royal funerary wealth. Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun became the most famous Egyptian pharaoh largely because his tomb survived more intact than most royal burials. He ruled for only about a decade and died while still very young. His reign followed the religious upheaval associated with Akhenaten, and officials under Tutankhamun restored traditional cults and royal institutions. When Howard Carter's team opened the tomb in 1922, they encountered nested shrines, chariots, furniture, clothing, weapons, food containers, jewelry, and the famous gold funerary mask. The discovery created an international sensation. Yet Tutankhamun's historical importance should not be measured by the modern fame of his treasures. His short reign is valuable because it helps illuminate a complicated moment when the Egyptian court was trying to restore stability after a radical experiment in religion and kingship. Akhenaten and Aten. Before Tutankhamun, King Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten and promoted the worship of the solar disk Aten with unusual intensity. He founded a new royal city at Akhetaten, modern Amarna, and supported an artistic style that differed sharply from earlier court conventions. Traditional gods, especially Ammonius, lost royal favor, and some divine names were attacked. Scholars debate whether Akhenaten's system should be called monotheism because the evidence is complicated, but the religious shift was certainly extraordinary by Egyptian standards. After his death, the experiment was largely dismantled. The court returned to older religious centers, and later rulers attempted to erase Akhenaten from official memory. Ironically, those efforts helped make the episode especially interesting to modern historians. It reveals that even a civilization famous for continuity could experience sudden ideological change. Ramesses II. Ramesses II ruled for more than 60 years in the 13th century BC and filled Egypt with monuments bearing his name. He fought the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh and later concluded a famous peace treaty with them. Egyptian temple reliefs portray Kadesh as a heroic personal victory, while the broader political outcome was more balanced. Ramesses also built extensively, including the great rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel in Nubia. His long reign allowed a generation of Egyptians to grow old knowing no other king. He had a large royal family and became a model of successful kingship for later periods. Modern tourism often presents Ramesses as the face of the new kingdom, but his monuments were part of a wider state involving thousands of craftsmen, soldiers, farmers, scribes, priests, and administrators. Abu Simbel and the Southern Horizon. At Abu Simbel, colossal seated statues of Ramesses II face outward from a temple cut into the rock near Egypt's southern frontier. A second temple honored Queen Nefertari and the goddess Hathor. The monuments projected royal power toward Nubia, a region that was both culturally distinct and deeply connected with Egypt through trade, conflict, migration, and political rule. In the 20th century, construction of the Aswan High Dam threatened the temples with rising water. An international campaign cut the monuments into large blocks and rebuilt them on higher ground. The rescue project became famous in its own right. Today, the relocated temples still overlook the landscape, offering a striking meeting point between ancient royal ambition, modern engineering, archaeology, and the changing waters of the Nile. Nubia. Nubia, stretching south of Egypt into what is now northern Sudan, was never simply a passive frontier. It contained its own communities, kingdoms, languages, resources, and political traditions. Gold was especially important to Egyptian interests, but Nubia also connected Egypt with trade routes deeper into Africa. At different times, Egyptian rulers conquered Nubian territory, built forts, established temples, and appointed administrators. At other times, powerful Nubian states challenged or ruled Egypt. Cultural exchange moved in both directions. Egyptian styles appeared in Nubia, while Nubian people served in Egyptian armies and communities. Centuries after the New Kingdom, kings from Kush would rule Egypt as the 20th dynasty. The southern Nile therefore reminds us that ancient Egyptian history was always connected with a larger African world. Trade beyond the Nile. Egypt's geography offered protection, but the civilization was never isolated. Cedar wood came from the Levant. Copper and other materials arrived through trade and mining networks. Gold moved north from Nubia. Luxury goods traveled from regions around the Red Sea and beyond. Mediterranean contacts brought pottery, oils, wine, timber, and ideas. Egyptian grain could become valuable abroad. Foreign merchants, diplomats, soldiers, craftsmen, prisoners, and migrants lived within Egyptian territory at different times. Royal art often presents foreigners in highly symbolic ways, emphasizing Egyptian order over distant peoples. Daily reality was more complicated. Border zones and ports were places of exchange. Ancient Egypt lasted so long partly because it could absorb outside influences while continuing to express a strong cultural identity of its own. The view from the river. For most travelers, Egypt was experienced from the level of the river rather than from a palace or desert summit. The banks moved slowly past. Farmers worked fields. Boats crossed between villages. Temple pylons appeared above trees. Desert cliffs rose beyond the green land. The same journey could connect royal capitals, local shrines, markets, quarries, and distant frontier zones. The Sea Peoples and a Changing World. Around 1200 BCE, political systems across the eastern Mediterranean experienced severe disruption. Several major states weakened or disappeared. Egyptian inscriptions from the reigns of Merneptah and Ramesses III describe conflicts with groups later called the Sea Peoples. Their exact identities and movements remain debated, and historians no longer explain the wider Bronze Age collapse through one invasion alone. Drought, warfare, internal unrest, migration, economic breakdown, and political instability may all have interacted. Egypt survived, but the new kingdom's imperial position weakened. Royal authority and resources became harder to maintain. The country entered another long period of competing dynasties and regional power. The Great Age of overseas campaigns had ended, yet Egyptian culture, temples, writing, and kingship continued. Survival did not require remaining unchanged. Priests, kings, and divided rule. During the Third Intermediate Period, Egypt was often divided among rulers based in different regions. Powerful priestly institutions, especially those connected with Ammonius at Thebes, controlled major resources. Libyan-descended families became important in the Delta and eventually established dynasties. The old image of one all-powerful pharaoh ruling an entirely centralized country did not always match political reality. Still, rulers continued to use familiar titles, rituals, and artistic forms. They restored monuments, built temples, and linked themselves with ancient traditions. This ability to reuse the past gave Egyptian kingship remarkable durability. A dynasty could be new, foreign in origin, or regionally limited and still present itself within a cultural system already more than 1,000 years old. Tradition became a political language that many different rulers learned to speak. The Kushite pharaohs. In the 8th century BCE, kings from Kush in Nubia expanded northward and eventually ruled Egypt. Historians call them the 25th dynasty. These rulers embraced Egyptian religious and royal traditions while also maintaining their own Nubian identity. Kings such as Pi and Taharka supported temples and presented themselves as restorers of proper order. Their rule connected the Nile Valley across a great distance, from the delta toward the heartlands of Kush. Conflict with the expanding Assyrian Empire eventually weakened their position in Egypt, and Kushite political power withdrew south. Yet the dynasty is important because it challenges any simple idea of Egypt as culturally separate from the rest of Africa. For a period, a southern Nile kingdom became the defender and ruler of ancient Egyptian tradition. Assyrians, Sate kings, and renewal. After Assyrian invasions and political upheaval, rulers based at Sais in the Delta established the 26th dynasty. The Sate kings looked deliberately toward Egypt's ancient past, reviving artistic forms and titles associated with earlier periods. At the same time, they operated in an increasingly international Mediterranean world. Greek merchants and mercenaries became more visible. Trade expanded. Egypt was both ancient and connected to new networks. This period illustrates a recurring Egyptian pattern. Revival did not mean copying the past exactly. Old styles could be used to strengthen legitimacy in a new political environment. Temples continued to receive support, scribes preserved traditional learning, and local cults remained active. Even after centuries of division and foreign pressure, Egyptian institutions could still generate a strong sense of continuity. Persian rule. In 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II conquered Egypt, making it part of the Achaemenid Empire. Persian rulers adopted Egyptian royal titles and were represented in traditional forms, but foreign rule could also generate resistance. Egypt regained independence for periods before being reconquered by Persia in the 4th century BC. These struggles show that Egyptian identity remained politically meaningful even after more than 2,000 years of dynastic history. The country was valuable because of its agriculture, strategic location, population, temples, and access to Mediterranean and Red Sea routes. Persian administration connected Egypt with an empire stretching far into Asia. Yet local religious institutions and communities continued to operate. Conquest changed who ruled at the top, but it did not erase the deep structures of Egyptian society overnight. Alexander arrives. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great entered Egypt during his campaign against the Persian Empire. He was welcomed by important groups who had little reason to defend Persian rule. Alexander founded the city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast and was recognized within Egyptian royal tradition. His stay in Egypt was brief, but the political consequences were enormous. After his death, one of his generals, Ptolemy, gained control of the country and eventually declared himself king. The Ptolemaic dynasty that followed was Macedonian Greek in origin, yet its rulers adopted many Egyptian royal forms. They sponsored temples, appeared before Egyptian gods, and participated in ancient traditions while also ruling a Greek-speaking court centered increasingly on Alexandria. Egypt entered a new cultural world without abandoning its older one. Ptolemaic Egypt. Ptolemaic Egypt was a society of overlapping languages, institutions, and traditions. Greek became important in government and urban life, while Egyptian remained widely spoken and continued in religious writing. Temples such as Edfu, Dendera, and Philae were built or expanded under Ptolemaic rulers in styles that appeared deeply traditional. Priests and kings negotiated power and resources. Alexandria grew into one of the Mediterranean's great cities, famous for scholarship, trade, royal wealth, and the legendary library associated with its intellectual institutions. The countryside, however, remained dependent on agriculture and the Nile. Taxation could be heavy, and social tensions sometimes became serious. Ptolemaic Egypt was both Hellenistic and Egyptian. Its rulers governed by combining traditions rather than replacing one civilization with another. Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra VII was the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty and one of the most famous figures from the ancient Mediterranean. She was highly educated and involved directly in the politics of a kingdom caught between powerful Roman rivals. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony became central to Roman political struggles and later legend. After Antony and Cleopatra were defeated by Octavian at Actium, both died in 30 BCE, and Egypt became a Roman province. Popular culture often reduces Cleopatra to romance and beauty, but her real situation was political. She was trying to preserve the independence and power of her dynasty in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. Her death ended pharaonic monarchy, but Egyptian religious and cultural traditions continued for centuries afterward. Egypt under Rome. Roman rule changed Egypt's political position, but did not immediately end ancient Egyptian culture. The country became an important supplier of grain to the Roman world. Emperors could still be represented as pharaohs on temple walls. Priests continued rituals, and hieroglyphic inscriptions remained in use. Greek was widespread in administration, while Egyptian language evolved through later scripts. Christianity gradually expanded during the Roman period and transformed the religious landscape. Temples lost support or were repurposed, and older cults declined at different rates in different places. The final known hieroglyphic inscription dates to the late 4th century CE at Philae. By then, the political world that created the pyramids was unimaginably distant, yet elements of Egyptian language, memory, landscape, and community continued into new eras. Stone and water. The contrast between stone monuments and moving water captures something important about Egypt. The river changed every season, while tombs and temples were designed to resist change. One supported life through repetition. The other preserved names through permanence. Egyptian civilization repeatedly joined these two ideas, renewal and endurance, within the same landscape. Why Egypt lasted so long? When people say ancient Egyptian civilization lasted 3,000 years, the phrase can create the illusion that nothing changed. In reality, Egypt experienced civil wars, foreign rulers, new technologies, religious transformations, shifting capitals, economic crises, migrations, invasions, and periods of strong centralized power followed by fragmentation. Its longevity came partly from adaptation. The Nile provided an enduring geographic foundation. Agricultural systems supported dense communities. Writing and temples preserved traditions. Kingship offered a familiar political language even to new dynasties. Local communities maintained religious and social practices across generations. Egypt changed constantly while presenting continuity as an ideal. That combination allowed institutions to survive repeated political shocks. The civilization lasted not because time stood still, but because people repeatedly rebuilt familiar structures in new circumstances. What the monuments leave out. Modern visitors naturally focus on pyramids, colossal statues, painted tombs, and temple columns because stone survives. Yet most of ancient Egypt was made from materials that disappeared more easily. Mud brick houses collapsed. Wooden objects decayed. Clothing wore out. Everyday conversations vanished. Farmers, servants, children, boatmen, soldiers, midwives, fishermen, and laborers rarely left monuments with their names carved in enormous letters. Archaeology tries to recover these quieter lives from settlements, rubbish heaps, bones, tools, letters, food remains, and damaged household objects. The surviving landscape can therefore distort our view. Kings dominate because kings built in stone. A complete history must look beyond them. Ancient Egypt endured because millions of people performed ordinary tasks year after year, keeping households, fields, workshops, boats, and communities working. The desert preserves. The same dry environment that made the Nile so essential also helped preserve remarkable evidence. Textiles, papyrus, wooden objects, food, human remains, and painted surfaces sometimes survived in desert tombs and settlements where moisture was limited. This preservation gives Egypt an archaeological record unlike almost anywhere else. Yet survival is uneven. Floodplains often buried or destroyed ancient settlements, while desert cemeteries remain more visible. This means archaeologists must constantly ask why certain evidence survived and other evidence did not. A beautifully preserved tomb may tell us more about burial than about daily life. A rubbish dump may reveal more about ordinary consumption than a royal inscription. The Egyptian past becomes clearer when grand monuments and humble fragments are studied together. The Nile seen from above. Aerial views make one truth especially easy to understand. Egypt is a civilization shaped by a narrow ecological corridor. The river winds through dry land and settlements cluster close to water. Ancient travelers experienced the landscape from boats and paths rather than from the sky, but the basic geography was the same. Green fields gave way quickly to desert. Towns occupied valuable ground near canals and transport routes. Temples and tombs were positioned with attention to river, horizon, cliffs, and cultivated land. Geography did not dictate every event, but it set strong conditions. The Nile helped unify a long kingdom. The desert protected some borders while providing routes and resources. The Mediterranean and Red Sea opened Egypt toward wider worlds. The civilization emerged from the interaction of all these landscapes. Giza at sunset. The pyramids of Giza eventually stopped functioning as active royal burial complexes, yet they never disappeared from the landscape. Later Egyptians lived among them, visited them, reused materials, told stories about them, and sometimes restored older monuments. Greek and Roman travelers came to see them. Medieval writers described them. Modern archaeology transformed them again into scientific sites and global tourist landmarks. Their meaning changed with every generation. For Khufu, the Great Pyramid was connected with royal eternity. For later visitors, it became evidence of a mysterious ancient past. For historians today, it is also evidence of labor, administration, engineering, religion, and social organization. As the sun moves across the plateau, the monuments seem timeless, but their history is a history of constant reinterpretation. Temples without their colors. Many ancient Egyptian monuments now appear in shades of sandstone, limestone, and granite. In antiquity, much of that architecture was painted. Columns, walls, ceilings, statues, and reliefs carried strong colors. Precious metal and polished stone reflected light. Cloth banners moved above temple entrances. Incense, chanting, animals, flowers, food offerings, and crowds added sound and smell to spaces that modern visitors often experience as quiet ruins. Remembering this helps restore some of the lost human world. Ancient Egyptians did not live in a museum of beige stone. Their sacred spaces were designed to feel alive and ordered. Even tombs hidden in desert cliffs could contain brilliant painted scenes. The ruins we see today are beautiful, but they're only the durable skeleton of environments once filled with color and ceremony. The names on the walls. Egyptian rulers repeatedly carved their names into temples and monuments because memory mattered. A name preserved in writing could help sustain identity after death. Later kings sometimes erased predecessors, replaced names, or carved new inscriptions over older surfaces. Such changes can look like vandalism to modern eyes, but they were often political acts within the ancient system of memory. The desire to be remembered shaped construction itself. Kings restored ancient monuments and claimed credit. Officials decorated tombs with biographies and family scenes. Ordinary people scratched prayers or names in places they visited. Writing turned walls into conversations across generations. Today, those names allow historians to rebuild sequences of rulers and events, even though the inscriptions were never intended as neutral history books. A civilization of change. Over 3 millennia, Egyptian language changed, artistic styles changed, military technology changed, and the political map changed. Horses and chariots arrived after the Pyramid Age. Bronze became common, then iron gradually appeared. International trade expanded and contracted. Foreign communities settled in Egyptian towns. New gods gained popularity while older cults changed meaning. Capital cities shifted between Memphis, Thebes, the Delta, and other centers. Yet Egyptians continued to look backward. A king living 1,000 years after Khufu could still present himself as heir to ancient order. A priest could copy a text already centuries old. An artist could revive an earlier style because its age gave it authority. Egypt's identity was built from this conversation between innovation and memory. The long river of history. Imagine traveling north on the Nile through time rather than distance. You might pass early farming villages before writing existed. Farther on, royal officials would appear, then the first stone monuments. The pyramids would rise at Giza. Centuries later, regional rulers would compete, then Middle Kingdom kings would reunite the land. New kingdom fleets and armies would move through a richer international world. Temples at Thebes would expand. Priests, Libyan dynasts, Kushite kings, Persians, Macedonians, and Romans would all claim authority in different eras. The river would continue beneath them. Fields would still need water. Boats would still carry people between communities. This continuity of landscape gives Egyptian history a remarkable sense of depth. Dynasties came and went while the Nile remained the central road through the country. What ancient Egypt gave the world. Ancient Egypt influenced neighboring societies through trade, diplomacy, religion, art, architecture, science, and political contact. Greek and Roman writers studied Egyptian traditions and often interpreted them through their own cultural assumptions. Egyptian motifs traveled far beyond the Nile. In modern times, archaeology and popular culture created new waves of fascination, sometimes accurate and sometimes deeply misleading. Egypt did not single-handedly invent every achievement later attributed to it, nor was it an isolated source of all civilization. Its real contribution is more interesting. It was one of the world's longest-lived complex societies, preserving an extraordinary record of how people organized states, understood death, managed water, built monuments, wrote literature, practiced religion, and adapted traditions over thousands of years. A quiet return to the Nile. At the end of this long journey, it is useful to return to the river. The largest monuments can make ancient Egypt feel like a civilization of stone, but water was always more fundamental. The Nile fed fields around which villages formed. Boats joined the two lands. Flood cycles shaped calendars. Priests described cosmic order through images drawn from the natural world. Kings used agricultural wealth to build temples and tombs. Foreign conquerors wanted Egypt partly because the valley remained rich and strategically important. Even today, modern cities and farms follow the river through the desert. The civilization of the Pharaohs is gone, but the geography that supported it remains visible. Seen from above, the Nile still traces the same long path northward toward the Mediterranean. 3,000 years in the landscape. Ancient Egypt lasted so long that the builders of late temples were already looking back on monuments older than many modern nations. A priest in the Ptolemaic period lived more than 2,000 years after the first dynasties. The Great Pyramid was already ancient when Cleopatra ruled. This scale of time is difficult to feel when history is reduced to a list of famous names. The landscape helps. Pyramid fields, desert cliffs, temples, old river channels, and cultivated plains belong to different centuries yet remain visible within one country. Each generation inherited traces of earlier generations and decided what to preserve, restore, imitate, ignore, or replace. Egyptian civilization was therefore never one single moment. It was a chain of communities connected by place, memory, language, institutions, and repeated acts of rebuilding. The story continues. The study of ancient Egypt continues because new discoveries and new methods keep changing what historians can ask. Archaeologists examine settlements once overshadowed by royal tombs. Scientific analysis reveals information about diet, disease, materials, trade, and movement. Satellite imagery helps locate ancient landscapes and buried features. Digital recording preserves fragile inscriptions. Scholars reconsider older assumptions about workers, women, foreigners, religion, and political power. At the same time, monuments face pressure from tourism, urban growth, pollution, groundwater, and climate. Preserving them requires careful choices. The past is not frozen. Our understanding of it changes as evidence grows. The ancient Egyptians wanted many of their names and monuments to endure. Thousands of years later, people are still reading them, questioning them, and finding new stories within the same stone. Night over Egypt. As daylight fades over the Nile, the ancient monuments settle into shadow. The fields remain green beside dark water, while desert stretches outward beyond the cultivated land. The pyramids hold the last light on the horizon. Farther south, temples stand beside modern towns, and cliffs conceal tombs cut by workers who lived more than 3,000 years ago. The silence of ruins can make the past seem distant, but the people who built them understood familiar things: work, family, ambition, fear, grief, celebration, politics, belief, and the desire to be remembered. Their civilization changed many times and eventually became part of other worlds, yet its record remains unusually rich. Ancient Egypt endures because the Nile, desert, stone, and written word preserved enough for later generations to listen.